To remove the steering column switch here, obviously you need to remove the airbag, then the steering wheel and the trim on the top and the bottom of it. Have a look at the interior trim video that I did for how to remove those. And then once this is off, and it's close to impossible to film this, but I'll just show you after I pulled it out. It's basically held just by a single screw there that clamps down around that there, and then that just slides straight off. But before then, there are two electrical connections. There's that one there, which slots into that spot there. So that's actually going to be, you'll have to get your head in underneath here to do that. And it has a single button on the side there that you press in, that just pops out nicely. And this one here actually goes in at the front under there. You'll actually need to get a screwdriver in there and really push it in a fair way, and once you do that enough, it actually just pops straight out, which is nice. There's a whole bunch of other connection stuff here. You don't have to touch any of those, it's just those two. In addition, you've got these things here that just presses into the back, into there, and that one there is just gripping onto one of those. I can't remember which one it is, but it's pretty obvious when you get around there that you just need to pry that one out. That just pulls straight out, and this one you just lever that off, and then once that's released, the thing just pops straight off. The only thing that was a little bit different with this car is with the lower trim, because this has the manual steering, to actually get that cover off on the electrical steering, like the car that I drive every day, it just has an electrical plug, so once you lower it, you disconnect that. Whereas with this one here, you can't get it off until there's a little screw under there, T20 I think it is. You just release that little handle pops off, and then that allows you to remove that cover down the bottom. This is the steering wheel switch. What I'm going to do is just explain what's here and how we can pull the thing apart. Firstly, at the front here you have what's sometimes called the clock spring, which is the way the switches on the steering wheel, etc., gets translated from that rotational movement of the steering wheel into something that can go to the car, which are via these buttons at the top here, as well as the airbag signals. In addition to that, inside here is the steering angle sensor, which I actually think comes via this connection down here. At the back here are all the connections for the actual the wiper stalk and that sort of thing. So depending on the type of car that you have, for example, my daily driver has the sports steering wheel with the paddle shifters, so it has an extra stalk down here. This one has the multifunctional steering wheel, so it doesn't have that there, because that's going to be fed through the steering wheel and through the clock spring. If you want to remove the steering angle sensor, there is a single screw. I've actually removed it, but it's just in there. You can pull that out, and then it talks about in the workshop manual actually disconnecting these plugs, but from what I've seen that makes no difference at all, because this thing just pulls off. It's just clipped on by two clips there and a couple of clips, one there and one there. There are other clips back here which are a little bit further back on the next piece of plastic back. It's not those, it's the bigger ones. These ones here unclip relatively simply, like such, and you can see it start to move forward there. These on the top, there's actually this piece of plastic here, so you kind of need to, they're a bit hard to sort of get those to move. There we go, so you sort of have to jam a screwdriver in there to sort of get them free of those things there. And I must point out, before you do this, make sure that you have this with the steering wheel perfectly centered. And when you pull it off, don't start to turn this thing around. Now, normally the only reason you'd ever want to remove this is to replace the thing, so it doesn't really matter. But if you do pull it off and you plan to use it again, do not start to turn this once it's off. It's off because it'll actually unravel, and if you ever pulled one of these things apart, they're pretty amazing inside, where you have all these strips, one of them which is going to be the contact element, so as it moves they sort of unravel, and if it gets all buggered up, then you will never ever get it back together again. So once that's off, you can put that to the side. On the back here, this is the big clamp that holds it on. Just unwind that out so it opens up a little, and then you just pull that off, and that'll just get that out of the way. And you'll see that because I have only one stalk on this side and two on the other, the actual circuit board is bigger on this side. I'll just pull off this side, but both sides are exactly the same. I take some photos as you go. But the way these work is on the end of it, for example, this is the cruise control, and there's a button on the end of it that will actually go to this little contact here, which will then go via the circuit board to some contactors here, which then goes to the front, which then will actually go to a connection at the back. Same on the other side here. This is the wiper stalk, so those things on the end there will go to that small connection there, then via the circuit board to here, and then out the other side. But for the movement up and down of the actual lever itself, there are wipers on contactors underneath this. So when you pull this off, don't just start to throw it around, because things will just pop off. You want to move it off slowly, take a photograph of the orientation of everything, and then you'll be able to easily put it back together again. And the reason I wanted to do this was I just wanted to clean up all the contacts, just in case some water had got inside. As it turned out, it hadn't got in there, which was kind of nice, but I just wanted to pull it apart and see how it all works. And when you get all those screws out, it's going to be sitting on a couple of guide pins, so it might be stuck on a little bit. Just grab hold of these plugs here and just gently pull those off. And underneath it, you'll see, for example, there are 4 wipers there. So there's one for the up and down and one for the in and out. Take a photograph of that, note the orientation, because you can actually fit these the wrong way around, just to make sure that they go back in the correct orientation. And you can see on the underside of that, there's all these contactors here that these things actually wipe to actually tell what position it's actually in. There's a bunch of resistors on here, so depending on the current flow of the circuit that it actually runs via is going to tell the system which position the stalk is in. If you want to disconnect these, that's pretty easy, so you can clean them up. They just pull off like that. There we go. And they'll be held underneath just a little clip there, so you can just pull those out if you need to, just to get those out of the way. A little wipers here, you can just pull those up really easy. They just sit on top of there. I'm not sure if you can see, there's a little bump there. I'm just going to pull all of those off. They're all interchangeable. And you can see, for example, if that is actually just use the indicators there, which is this one here. If I move it, that's obviously going to be doing that for the one that swipes up and down that way. And when I push it in and out, that's going for the high beam, I think it is. Yep. Then that's going to be moving that other one. When you fit these wipers, obviously take a photograph before you go, but when you fit them, if you fit them in the wrong orientation, it's pretty obvious, because you'll have a big gap at one end and a small gap at the other. If you fit them in the correct orientation, they're not equal, but they're pretty close to being equal, the gaps on each end. That's not correct. There we go, so you can see, whilst it's not equal, it's pretty close. Also, there's actually a hole down the bottom here that you can actually see that pin that it sits on. So when it's actually engaged correctly with the pin underneath it, make sure that you can actually see that between those two contactors. Also with that circuit board, if you actually just turn it over, you can see the contacts underneath it, and it's pretty obvious where what the orientation of those wipers need to be. And when they're in there, they shouldn't be able to move around because they're locked on those pins. On the underside there, just get some alcohol and clean up those sliders if that's what you want to do. And then prior to putting that circuit board on, we can put on the connectors. Now I think the smaller one can actually come on afterwards if you wanted to, but the big one won't. It'll actually be locked in place, so you won't be able to. So checking all those sliders are in the correct position, and then we can place that back down and put those screws in place. I made a mark here just before I actually really understood what was going on, but it can only go on in one orientation because there is a key at the top and bottom which goes into corresponding size keys on the clock spring. There's a small one at the bottom and the big one at the top, so it's impossible to get it the wrong way around. And this is the thing that turns off your indicators. So for example, if I turn left and I turn, and it's got to go to about 45 degrees, and I'm not sure if you can hear this. There's a very faint click as it clicks on, and that means it's gone far enough, and then turn it back and it's going to click the thing off. Let's turn right, faint click, which is why sometimes if you go through a really gentle turn, unless you turn that steering wheel through about 45 degrees, it doesn't actually go past obviously a little latch inside there that is then going to engage it to pull it off afterwards. The bit here in the middle that turns the indicators on or turns the indicators off when you go around a corner, I think it also has something to do with the steering wheel angle sensor which sits inside here. But interestingly, when I put this back together after I'd just been mucking around with it, I got a whole bunch of PSM, or got a PSM failure, and the steering started to do some really, really weird stuff. Where like you're driving straight ahead and it's trying to turn the wheels all by itself. And when I started to play with this, I've realized that this thing just doesn't freewheel round and round. It seems as though there is a geared something inside here that will restrict the amount of movement that it gives it. So for example, that's all the way left there now, and if I turn that 4.5 turns the other way, it stops again. So I can only imagine that there is gearing in this that actually that will move at half the pace of this thing here, which then is sensed by this to tell the angle of it. And I can only assume the reason for that is so you can easily tell, like straight ahead to a full turn in either direction, because it's going to move what I'm assuming a magnet or something like that in there, which is going to be sensed by the steering angle sensor. So if you start mucking around with this, I would advise not to, but the way to center this up is to go to full lock in one direction and then go 2.5 turns like that to the central position, and that it should have everything centralized. This should now slot straight over the top of it. It would before if it wasn't in the correct position, but now it is, and it should be 2.25 turns in either direction before it hits the stops, and the steering angle sensor should work okay. Installation of the clock spring steering wheel sensor is pretty simple. Just make sure it's orientated correctly, and then we're just going to push it on and just clip it straight on, and then put that single screw down the bottom there.